Hello, my brilliant students, and welcome to your final week with me to Module 7, our last week in our 2-month journey through the exploration of collection analysis and technology. And this week is kind of light on the discussion type work and heavier, obviously, because your final paper is due and then the exam will open on the weekend, and you'll have 48 hours to complete that exam. So I highly recommend the exam and the paper are due the same day, but it would probably behoove you from a studies approach to try to get the paper done in advance of when that exam opens so that you can concentrate fully on the comprehensive exam for the 48 hours that it's open. It is obviously open book, but it's a check on learning, and it does have some stuff in there that I expect you to be able to know off the cuff. It's going to ask you to draw your own conclusions, basically. This week in discussion, we're going to talk about how intelligence methods versus national interests. And what does that mean? We're going to end on sort of an ethical note based on everything that we've studied so far. I think that you guys should be able to walk away from this course with a pretty solid foundation in understanding the rights and wrongs of how the intelligence community is designed to operate and the intent of that architecture and what it's supposed to do, whether it's supporting the federal government or whether it is at local or state level law enforcement or whether it's the FBI, federal law enforcement, or Department of Homeland Security, okay? That consumer relationship, right, where you're the worker over here and you're providing that information to the consumer, and that consumer is, the customer's always right, as they say, or maybe not so in this case, but that is the person that we're trying to satisfy and inform their decisions as they guide our nation through whatever it is that they're going to guide our nation through, right? So essentially what I'm after here is I want you to sit and think about everything that we've discussed in this semester and some of the things that we've seen that are for good and bad, and do an assessment at your level, which is obviously a neophyte as a student, but to look at that and say, do the ends justify the means? We have the intelligence community, we have national interests, and we have national security, right? So we have the security is the real thing, right? It's shutting the door. My national interest is, where did I put my key so I can shut the door, right? And then my intelligence effort is, let me help you find your key so that we can ensure that the door is shut, right? Sometimes over here, it gets a little gray, right? It gets a little gray. The security will always be the security, apart from the subjective decisions that are made about what constitutes a national security thing, right? What constitutes an issue of national security. Thankfully, the checks and balances of the U.S. system are designed to ensure that no one person, for the most part, has the ability to define that purely unto themselves, and it's a collaborative effort, right? To sit down and go, this is what it is. What's our economic state going to be in 2050? What's our partnership going to be with China and Russia and India, right? The largest democracy in the world, India is. Who are the economic giants going to be? China and India, as an example. How will the U.S. continue to interact with them? What does that mean for us and, say, our partners like the United Kingdom? What's the future of the European Union? These are big political type questions, right? At the state level, it could be something here in Arizona. I'm going to use Arizona as an example. What do I do about federal laws that dictate how I'm supposed to do my business? How do I budget to be able to take care of things that are inherently an Arizona issue, but some things that are federal issues? How do I get information from the federal government or Department of Homeland Security that informs my local law enforcement regarding border security, as an example? Or do I trust simply that that's just DHS's issue, right, and U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, because they're federal entities. So these are interests, right, relative to national security, and sometimes those interests can impact how we go about our collection and our analysis. As we looked at when we talked about analysis, and we talk about things like groupthink, right, and places where an analyst is sometimes afraid to make a hard shot and say, nope, that's not what that is. And things get manipulated or they get turn, and I don't want to end on a negative note, but I want to end on an ethical note. So we've looked at this entire process, and I'm going to ask you this week, when you look at intelligence methods versus national interests, are they lockstep? Is it okay? Is your perception that we're okay the way we're going on? If we outsource technology, et cetera, or we do it ourselves, are we okay there? Or sometimes do the ends not justify the means, and there's some dangers or pitfalls in there, okay? You know what your final paper assignment is by now. Hopefully you've looked at that prompt and you understand what it is, but this topic kind of dovetails with it as you look at a future threat scenario in which we would have to provide intelligence related to it. What I'm after here, simply put, to come away from the syllabus is when we look at like the FISA warrants, and this is going back now, right, 15 years, soon to be 20 years, but when we look at like the FISA warrant process and we look at the U.S. Patriot Act as an example, when those were invoked by the United States, it was at a critical time in U.S. history where people were really feeling not so safe and really distraught over what had recently happened in the United States, et cetera. So we have to take them at face value and say that they were probably put into place specifically to provide national security, right? So national interest, to provide national security so that the citizens felt safe again, so they felt some level of safe. Because of the fact that some of those guys were in the United States before it happened, there were other issues then of how do we prevent that person from that has come into our country from doing this again. And we're seeing even the ripple effects of that even now when we look at immigration policy and things like that. And that's a topic for another class, but certainly our nervousness and our anxiety over earlier issues informs our approaches to present and future issues. That's how I would put it, right? And so, and I don't want to talk about immigration, but when we look at those guys that were in the United States and they were here legally, when they came in, we wish we would have caught them, right? So when the NSA, and I know I've used NSA a lot in this course, and I beg your pardon for that, and I should probably diversify a little bit more and use like DIA, which is all source, and CIA, which is more human, but I know my background, and so that's why I use that for example. So when the NSA came up with the PRISM program, whoever designed that program probably had the best interests of national interests at heart in terms of national security, of the ability to gather data that could eventually secure the nation against a potential internal threat, or identify somebody inside the United States that had communication outside the United States that could also be a threat, as an example. Coming back to the prompt for this week, though, somewhere along the line, that FISA process of when we found out that person was a U.S. citizen, and there should have been a legal process that was followed before we were able to execute our intelligence functions, somebody made a decision somewhere to basically say there's not enough time, or the process takes, and I'm swagging here because I wasn't there, right? But somebody made a decision to circumvent that system. That's probably the most objective way to say it. Circumvent that system to get the data, even though they knew that what they were doing was illegal because it was outside the scope of the process that had been put into place. So that's a negative example. But when we talk about it this week on an ethical perspective, when we look at national interests and national security, and we look at everything that we've explored now in collection, analysis, and technology, ask yourself your perception right now. Did the ends justify the means? Are we good right now? Will we be good in the future? Or is there always going to be this danger in there, right? The old expression, who watches the watchers? Who's watching the watchers as they're watching everybody else, right? Oversight. How does that work? And so that's really what that last question is. And you can respond to each other. Again, I don't want to encroach on your time for the final paper and the exam, and that's why I kind of let you off the hook for the response of it. But I'm curious to get your perceptions. So there is no really wrong answer here, but I'm curious to get your perceptions of what you've learned in this class in terms of how that applies to ethics and the constitutionality of the United States and how we employ this ginormous intelligence apparatus that we have built in the United States, ostensibly for national security, which I personally do believe in national security. I wouldn't have committed my life to it, as a military person. So I'm trying to stay objective here. That being said, I do understand that it can be exploited and misused and abused by people for reasons of power or because they feel they know better than everybody else. A lot of times when I see places where people have misstepped, that's exactly what I think is that person in that moment made a decision that they knew more than anybody else that was around them, and therefore they made that decision, and then they stepped over that bound of what the defined legal process was supposed to be. So that's it, and that's pretty much what I'm after this week. So take a look at that. Give me your feelings on it. Again, if you want to respond to it, if you want to read each other's and respond, that's fine. You should be working on your final paper. You should already have like an outline draft going on and starting to write that down. And again, the exam will open Friday night at midnight. It will be open until Sunday night at midnight. Your final paper and your discussion are also due Sunday night at midnight. But from a pragmatic perspective, I would highly advise that you try to get the discussion and the paper out so that you can focus on the exam over the weekend, okay? It has been my absolute pleasure to work with you in this semester. I very much enjoy teaching. I apologize that I talk so quickly. I swear when I am speaking, I don't feel like I'm talking that quickly. But when I start to to get into the moment and sharing that moment, then sometimes I speak a little quickly. If we were in a classroom, it probably wouldn't happen that much because I'd have eye contact, which would help me a little bit. But so I appreciate your patience with me in this video format, and you've been a lovely class, and I hope that you walk away from this course having learned a little bit more about not just the intelligence community and how we do our operations for collection and analysis, but also an informed citizen who's living in this country, so that we understand how those processes are supposed to work, and that we can work with them to best support all of us across the board, and not be afraid of them, right? Understand what they are and not be afraid of them, but control them and make them work the way they're supposed to work for the greater good of the citizenry, all right? So thank you so much. I wish you all the best in your future. Take care, and have a lovely break. Farewell.